Picture a hillside covered in green. Dozens of plants growing side by side, and to an untrained eye, they all look roughly the same: leaves, stems, berries, roots. A few of them are food. A few of them will make you violently ill. And one or two will stop your heart within hours. There is no way to tell them apart by looking. No color code, no warning, nothing written anywhere. And a small group of humans has to eat something today. This is the problem. And the obvious answer that somebody brave just tried things. Until they found what worked falls apart the moment you look at it closely. Because with real poisons, the first test is often the last test you ever take. Trial and error only works if you survive the errors. A species that learned about food purely by dying of it would not have lasted long enough to learn much. So how did they know? The answer isn't one clever ancestor tasting berries. It's a stack of systems, some built into the body, some built into the group that together solved one of the hardest problems any animal faces. And the first layer is running in your mouth right now. Start with bitterness. When something tastes bitter, you recoil. Not by choice. Not after weighing it up. The reaction happens before any thought arrives. An instant rejection that pulls your face into a grimace and makes you want to spit. Children do it violently. Adults learn to override it for coffee and dark chocolate, but the flinch is always there underneath. That reflex is not fussiness. It's a chemical alarm. Many of the compounds plants use to defend themselves, alkaloids, and similar toxins happen to taste intensely bitter. Plants make these substances precisely so they won't be eaten, and animals that could detect them had an enormous advantage. Over deep time, our lineage developed a whole family of bitter taste receptors, dedicated equipment for detecting exactly this class of danger. Humans have a striking number of them. That's not an accident. It's the residue of an ancient arms race between things that wanted to be eaten and things that very much did not. So the first line of defense was not knowledge at all. It was the tongue, reacting faster than thought, and without needing to be taught anything. Bitterness meant stop and. That single involuntary reflex screened out a huge portion of the deadly plants on that hillside before anyone had to make a decision about them. But bitterness only catches some poisons. Plenty of dangerous things taste fine. So there's a second layer, and it's uglier. Consider what happens when someone eats something genuinely bad. The body responds with a violent, coordinated shutdown, nausea, vomiting, sometimes worse. The obvious purpose is expulsion. Get the poison out. But there's a second function that matters just as much, and it lasts far longer than the illness. You never want to eat that thing again. Anyone who has been badly sick after a particular meal knows this. The specific food becomes repulsive, sometimes for years, sometimes permanently. Even when you know, logically, that the food wasn't at fault, the aversion doesn't care. Just thinking about it turns your stomach. That reaction feels like an overreaction. And in modern life, it usually is. But it isn't a malfunction. It's the system working exactly as designed. And this is where something remarkable comes in. Because the learning involved is unlike almost any other kind of learning humans do. Normally, learning takes repetition. To learn a skill, a route, a face, a word, the brain needs the experience multiple times before it sticks. But taste aversion doesn't work that way. One bad experience is enough. A single episode of serious illness after eating something can create an aversion that lasts a lifetime, formed instantly, without practice and without any conscious decision. Researchers have studied this closely, and it's an unusually powerful and specific form of learning. The brain will link a taste to a sickness that arrived hours later, which is something it almost never does with other kinds of cause and effect. Think about why that exists. For most things in life, learning slowly is fine. For food, learning slowly is fatal. If your ancestors needed 3 or 4 poisonings to learn a lesson, they wouldn't have survived to apply it. So the mind evolved a special channel for this one problem. Eat, get sick, never again. One trial, permanent. Written in immediately and hard to erase. That combination, an alarm on the tongue and a memory system, that learns in one shot kept individuals alive. But it still doesn't answer the whole question because both systems only work times after times someone has eaten something dangerous. They reduce the damage. They don't prevent it. To actually get ahead of the problem, our ancestors needed something else. They needed a protocol. When approaching an unfamiliar plant, the sensible strategy is not to eat it. It's to test it in a way designed around the assumption that you might be wrong. A tiny amount, not a meal. Touched to the lips or held on the tongue first to check for burning or numbness or bitterness. Then a small taste, and then a wait hours. Sometimes a full day watching the body for any sign of a reaction, before allowing a single mouthful more. It sounds slow because it is slow, and it is slow on purpose. Every step in that sequence is built around the assumption that this plant might be dangerous, so that the cost of being wrong is measured in discomfort and lost time rather than in a life. Caution of that kind is what a species does. When it has no way to look up the answer, no one to ask, and no margin for a confident mistake. And there was one more source of clues. Other animals. Watching which plants, birds, and mammals ate gave a rough signal about what might be edible. It's a genuinely useful heuristic, and it's also a dangerous one because other species tolerate things that would harm a person, and some things safe for humans are poison to animals. It was a useful hint, but never a guarantee, and treating it as one would eventually get somebody killed. Now we come to the real answer. Because everything so far describes how one person, alone, might survive a bad guess. None of it explains how humans came to know, confidently, which of thousands of species were food. That knowledge did not come from any individual. It came from the group, and from time. This is the thing that changes everything. Your ancestors almost never faced that hillside alone, and almost never faced it fresh. By the time a young person went out to gather, the answers already existed. Which plants to take and which to leave. Which berries were fine and which looked identical but weren't. Which root was food in one season and dangerous in another. Which mushroom was dinner and which was death. All of it had been worked out already, not by one person, but by a long chain of people stretching back further than anyone could count, and paid for in the currency of ancestors who got it wrong. That last part deserves a moment because it is the grim engine underneath the whole system. Every rule about which plant to avoid was written, somewhere back down the line, by somebody who found out the hard way, and the reason the rule existed at all was that their group watched it happen, understood what it meant, and refused to let the lesson disappear with the person who paid for it. A death from a poisonous plant was a tragedy. But in a group with memory and language, it was also information, and information, unlike the person, could be kept. It became a warning. The warning became a rule. The rule became something every child in that group simply knew. Told to them so early and so often that they could not remember learning it until eventually nobody in the group had any idea which ancestor had died to establish it. That is the quiet trade at the heart of human survival. A handful of terrible individual accidents converted into permanent collective knowledge. This is what culture actually is, underneath the word. A way for a group to accumulate knowledge faster than any individual could ever discover it, and to hold that knowledge across generations, so that each new person starts not from nothing, but from everything already learned. No other species does this at anything close to the human scale. A single human being dropped into an unfamiliar landscape, with no guide and no inherited knowledge of what grows there, is in real and immediate trouble. But that same human being, raised inside a community that has lived in that landscape for centuries, is carrying in their head the distilled experience of hundreds of lives and will walk across that hillside seeing not a confusing wall of green, but a map of what to take and what to leave alone. And it's worth naming who carried the most of it. In a world without writing, the memory of the group lived in its oldest members. The elder, who had seen 40 seasons, knew which plants appeared in a drought year, which ones had made someone sick a generation ago, which patch was safe and which was not. That knowledge had no backup copy. It existed only in living minds, and it was maintained by being told repeatedly to people who would need it later. The stories, the warnings, the specific instructions passed down about which things to avoid, these were not folklore in the dismissive sense. They were the survival database, and speaking them aloud was how the group kept it from being lost. Then there's a final layer, and it's the most sophisticated of all, because it goes beyond sorting food from poison. It changes the category. Some of the plants that fed entire civilizations are, in their raw state, genuinely dangerous. Cassava, a starchy root that remains a staple for hundreds of millions of people today, contains compounds that can release cyanide when the plant tissue is broken down. Eaten straight from the ground, it can poison you badly, and in some varieties, it can kill. But process it correctly, soaking it, grating it, pressing out the liquid, fermenting it, cooking it in a specific sequence that has to be followed properly, and those compounds are broken down and driven off, leaving behind a food that has sustained whole populations across continents for thousands of years. Acorns tell a similar story. Bitter with tannins and hard on the body when raw, but leached with repeated washing in running or changed water, they become a reliable, storable food source, and they were exactly that for many peoples around the world. Sit with what that actually means. Somebody, somewhere, worked out a multi-step chemical procedure with no chemistry, no theory of what a toxin even was, and no possible way to observe what was happening at the molecular level, and then that procedure had to be transmitted, intact and in the correct order, across generations of people, who also could not see what it was doing or why it worked. The knowledge had to survive perfectly, or near enough, because a half-remembered version of it would not simply produce worse food. It would produce poison, and it would kill the people who trusted it. That is not foraging. That is technology, in the fullest sense of the word. A repeatable procedure that transforms the properties of a material, developed by trial and observation, refined over time, and taught to the next generation as a fixed method. Ancient humans didn't only learn which foods were safe. They learned to make foods safe, and in doing so they expanded what counted as edible far beyond anything nature had offered them directly. So stack the whole thing together. A tongue that raises an alarm at the taste of poison. A body that punishes a mistake so violently that it's learned in a single trial. A cautious protocol built for being wrong. Hints taken from the animals around them. A group that remembered, and elders who carried the record. And processing techniques that could take a poison and turn it into a staple. No single layer would have been enough. Together, they let a soft, slow animal with no natural knowledge of chemistry eat its way across every environment on Earth. Now come back to your kitchen. Everything you ate today was pre-approved. Someone else decided it was safe long before it reached you, grown, inspected, tested, regulated, labeled, and stacked on a shelf with a date printed on the side. You have never once looked at something and had to genuinely decide whether eating it might kill you. The hardest food question you face is what you feel like, and the entire apparatus that makes that possible is invisible to you. But the old machinery is still there. You still flinch at bitterness. You still get an unreasoning wave of revulsion at a food that once made you sick. Those reflexes are useless in a supermarket, and they are not modern quirks. They are the last working parts of a survival system that kept your ancestors alive on that hillside back when a wrong guess about a handful of berries was the end of the story. You don't have to know which plants can kill you. Someone already found out and made sure you'd never need to. If you made it this far, you are exactly the kind of person this channel exists for. We make videos like this one every week about ancient human behavior, about what your body still remembers, and about the gap between the world you were built for and the one you actually live in. If that is something you want more of, hit subscribe. It costs you nothing, and it tells the algorithm that this kind of storytelling is worth keeping alive. See you in the next one.